Hey guys, tonight we step barefoot into warm sand and broken brick, into a city that has been sleeping for thousands of years, while the wind gently combs the rubble like it's tidying up a forgotten room. You can almost hear it, that soft grit between your toes, the faint clink of pottery shards, the distant hush of a river that used to be the whole reason anyone bothered to live here at all. Our title is a little dramatic, sure, but we're going to handle it the safe way. Some parts are widely accepted history, some parts are interpretation, and some parts are calm. What if imagination will keep the solid ground separate from the mist? We're not proving anything tonight. We're following clues. And yes, the word Anunnaki is going to show up, but we'll treat it as a label that later people used, not a guarantee of literal visitors in the sky. You probably won't survive this, not in the heroic way, but in the way you'll survive by falling asleep halfway through and waking up with your phone on your face like a historical artifact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop a comment with your location and your local time, because I love imagining this story drifting into bedrooms and buses and late-night kitchens all over the planet. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You move slowly through the remains of a temple city, not as a conqueror, not as a detective with a magnifying glass, but as a quiet listener. You are here to meet the oldest kind of voice humans left behind, writing pressed into clay, not paper, not stone carved with fancy drama. Clay, simple and honest, like somebody grabbed the nearest mud, shaped it into a tablet, and said, "I need this thought to outlive me." Most historians agree that the earliest known writing systems developed in ancient Mesopotamia, and the Sumerians are right at the heart of that story. The evidence we do have points to a practical beginning, or accounting, lists, rations, shipments, temple goods. You can picture it, the ancient version of someone staring at a spreadsheet, except the spreadsheet is wet clay and the stylus is a cut reed. If you've ever complained about paperwork, just remember, a Sumerian clerk invented paperwork and then had to bake it so it would last. That is commitment, and also a kind of curse. You step into a museum-like silence in your mind, because you're not touching these tablets tonight, just imagining them. They are small enough to fit in two hands, sometimes no bigger than a phone, except these are phones that only send messages forward in time. The marks look like tiny wedges, neat and repetitive, almost soothing. Cuneiform is the kind of script that makes you feel calm and overwhelmed at the same time, like staring at a beehive and realizing each cell is a syllable. Here's the mainstream anchor that matters. These tablets come from real places, from real cities that archaeology has mapped and dug, from layers of habitation stacked like a cake nobody asked for. Uruk, Nippur, Lagash, names that sound like they could be characters in a fantasy novel, except they were crowded neighborhoods with drainage problems and taxes. And the people there argued, flirted, prayed, and worried about grain like people always do. What's broadly accepted is that Sumer wasn't a single empire at first, but a patchwork of city-states each with its own patron deity, its own temple, its own politics, and its own pride. As you walk through the imagined city, you notice how the world feels shaped by mud and water. The earth is flat and open, the horizon wide, the sky huge. This is a landscape that makes you pay attention to what's above you, because there's nothing blocking your view. It's possible that living under that enormous sky, night after night, makes you feel watched, not necessarily by aliens, but by patterns, stars that return, planets that wander, eclipses that arrive like a sudden curtain. One interpretation is that early Mesopotamian myths are not random stories, but structured explanations built from what mattered most: survival, water management, harvest timing, legitimacy of rulers, and the terrifying unpredictability of the rivers. If you manage a canal system, you don't just do engineering, you do fate. You decide who gets water and who doesn't. And once you have that kind of power, you start speaking in the language of the sacred. Because sacred language makes rules feel heavier. You pause at a temple platform in your mind, a raised place where the city's heartbeat is loudest. The temple is not only a religious building, it is also a warehouse, a bank, an employer, a landlord. Archaeology suggests these institutions organized labor, collected goods, and redistributed food. In a world without modern governments, the temple is the closest thing to a system that can coordinate thousands of people. That's not a mystical claim. That's a bureaucratic miracle. And if you've ever tried to coordinate a group chat for dinner plans, imagine coordinating harvest labor with no emojis. You start to understand why people might describe their organizing force as divine. In the quiet air, you can almost hear the scrape of a stylus. A scribe sits cross-legged, shoulders hunched, doing the ancient equivalent of just one more email. This is where the story earns its title's first word: texts. Sumerian texts are not one book. They are a huge library of fragments and genres: administrative records, hymns, myths, royal inscriptions, legal documents, proverbs, school exercises. Some are direct and practical. Some are poetic. Some are political. Some are clearly meant to entertain or teach. When people say Sumerian texts reveal, the careful way to hear it is: these texts show what people wrote down, and writing down something is a clue about what mattered. Now the mystery angle, kept gentle and honest. A careful reading might suggest that some mythic themes could preserve older memories in a transformed way. Not necessarily literal memories, like a video recording, but cultural memories, the kind that survive as shapes. Like how you remember a dream. You don't remember every detail, but you remember the feeling, the silhouette, the sense of motion. So you come to the question your title is flirting with: Earth's history before the Anunnaki arrived. The solid ground first, in the earliest Sumerian materials. The word Anunna, or Anunnaki, is commonly used in mythological contexts as a group associated with gods or divine assembly. Most historians agree that in Sumerian religion, these are not framed as astronauts with tool belts, but as divine figures within a pantheon. The evidence we do have points to a religious and literary setting, not a technical report. That's the documented anchor. But humans are humans, and humans love to ask, what if? A popular rumor claims that the Anunnaki were literal beings from elsewhere, and that Sumerian stories are coded history. This theory isn't widely accepted, but It continues to circulate because it scratches a particular itch, the itch of feeling like the ancient world was hiding a bigger secret. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can ask a more interesting question that doesn't require us to force the tablets into being something they aren't. What if the real shock isn't alien arrival, but the deep antiquity of human imagination and organization? You stand near a canal. Water slides along a man-made path, and you feel the calm logic of it. Water goes where you tell it. Crops grow where you feed them. The city forms where you can store food. What's broadly accepted is that irrigation agriculture was fundamental in southern Mesopotamia, and with it came complex administration. That complexity leaves traces, and one trace is the need to record, to count, to measure. Those measurements become symbols. Symbols become language. Language becomes stories. Stories become identity. Here's where the before-arrival idea can be handled responsibly. There is a before that is documented, before the texts, before writing, before cities. Archaeology suggests that earlier communities existed in the region long before the earliest cuneiform. People farmed, herded animals, built villages, traded goods. They watched seasons. They buried their dead. They told stories that were never written down. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. When writing begins, it doesn't create humanity. It simply turns the lights on in one particular room and leaves the rest of the house in shadow. You stroll through that shadowed house in your mind. If you want a sleep-friendly chill, imagine a long corridor of time, doors on both sides. Some doors are open, lit by tablets and ruins. Most doors are closed, because organic things decay and voices vanish. So when you ask about Earth's shocking history before some named group arrived, the safer phrasing is, what happened in the unrecorded centuries that shaped the world the Sumerians inherited? One interpretation is that many of the mythic arrivals in Sumerian stories, gods descending, kingship descending, sacred objects appearing, are poetic ways of talking about real transitions, new social systems, new technologies, new forms of authority. A more cautious explanation could be that the language of descent and gift is how a culture frames legitimacy. If a king says authority came down from heaven, he is not writing a diary entry. He is making a claim. It's propaganda, with incense. And yes, you can feel the temptation to turn every phrase into a secret. Came down from heaven becomes a spacecraft. Divine assembly becomes a council of aliens. Me, the Sumerian concept of sacred powers or ordered principles, becomes advanced technology. But that leap is not required by the texts. It's a choice. Sometimes it's imaginative and fun. Sometimes it's misleading. Tonight, we keep it playful and labelled. Historians still argue whether certain mythic narratives preserve faint traces of older events, or whether they are mostly literary constructions shaped by later political needs. That debate matters, because it gives you permission to be curious without being careless. You can wonder without declaring. You can explore without pretending you solved anything. You pass a schoolroom, because Sumer had schools for scribes. The thought of a kid in ancient Mesopotamia doing homework is oddly comforting. Picture a student practicing wedge marks, copying proverbs, getting corrected by a teacher who has seen everything and is not impressed. A little clay tablet sits on the floor with lines of practice text. That's the human reality underneath the cosmic language, even if a myth mentions gods. A teenager still had to learn how to write the word for barley correctly. And you can feel that teenager's sigh across millennia, if that doesn't make history intimate. Nothing will. Now the cinematic what if, gently framed as imagination. What if the first reveal is not about visitors from the sky, but about visitors from the future? You are the one arriving, eyes wide, trying to decode a world that never expected you. And what if the shock is realizing that the Sumerians were already living in a kind of science fiction? They engineered landscapes, tracked celestial movements, and built institutions that could outlast individual lives. They made a new kind of reality where a city could be bigger than any family, and where rules could be written down so they didn't vanish with a mood. The fan hum in your room blends with imagined wind over reeds. You keep walking. You find yourself near a stack of tablets, not literally stacked like a neat library, but buried, broken, scattered, discovered in pieces. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And here the evidence is thin for any literal arrival narrative in the sense modern rumors mean. But the evidence is rich for something else. The arrival of writing, the arrival of bureaucracy, the arrival of cities, the arrival of myths that can travel. You look at a tablet that isn't about gods at all. It's about sheep, or beer, or rations. And you feel the way mundane details anchor the whole thing. This is one reason mainstream scholars trust the world behind the texts, because so much of it is boring in the most reassuring way. Nobody invents thousands of mundane receipts just to smuggle a cosmic secret. The boring parts are the bedrock. The poetic parts are the skyline. And yet, you also notice that the skyline matters. A hymn might describe a deity with thunderous language, or depict a temple as the center of the world. A king might claim divine favor. A myth might picture a council of gods deciding human fate. That's where the mist rolls in, the place where interpretation lives. One interpretation is that these stories are a mirror held up to society. Gods behave like institutions. Deities feud like city-states. Cosmic order resembles irrigation order. Heaven looks suspiciously like a palace. So when someone says, Sumerian texts reveal Earth's shocking history before the Anunnaki arrived, you can translate it into a calmer, more grounded curiosity. Sumerian texts let you glimpse how ancient people imagined the deep past and framed their present. The shock is not that humans were helpless until someone arrived, but that humans were already building worlds with language. You leave the temple area and drift into residential streets, narrow, winding, full of walls that once held laughter and arguments. Somewhere, a potter turns clay into a jar. Somewhere, someone pours a drink and tells a story. Somewhere, a priest watches the stars and marks a pattern. You feel the beginnings of a long conversation between sky and soil, between number and myth, between record and rumor. And as you keep moving through the night-soft city, you let yourself hold a final quiet thought, not as a claim, but as a mood. What if the oldest before is not about outsiders at all, but about the part of human history that never got written down? The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And in that uncertainty, your mind can relax because you don't have to solve it. You just have to listen. You drift toward the river's edge, where the land looks like it is still deciding whether it wants to be water or earth. The air is cool, and you can smell silt and reeds, that clean, muddy scent that says life is happening even when nobody is watching. In the distance, a line of palm trees stands like quiet witnesses. A dog barks once, then thinks better of it, because even the dog can tell this is a place built for listening. What's broadly accepted is that the people of southern Mesopotamia learned to live with rivers that did not behave politely. The water could nourish fields or swallow them. And so you watch the real miracle unfold, not in lightning or prophecy, but in geometry. The canal, a cut made through land so water can be persuaded, not conquered, to go where it's needed. Archaeology suggests that irrigation systems were essential for sustaining large populations in this region, and that maintaining them required coordination. The canal is a line drawn across chaos, and you can feel how that simple line changes everything. You walk along an embankment, and you notice that canals are not only engineering, they are social agreements. Somebody has to dig. Somebody has to maintain. Somebody has to decide whose field gets water first when the heat bites hard and the flow thins out. In a place like this, water is not just water. It is power that moves. So your mind starts to see the city-state as a living organism. The canal is an artery. The fields are lungs. The granary is the stomach. The temple is the brain, at least in the way it collects information and redistributes resources. Most historians agree that early urban life in Sumer involved complex institutions that organized labor and managed surplus. It's possible that the language of order and cosmic rule in later texts is partly a poetic reflection of this daily struggle to keep the system stable. You come to a spot where a small gate controls a branch canal. The wood is rough, the rope is stiff, and the person tending it has the tired expression of someone who knows that one mistake will lead to complaints from 3 directions. If you've ever worked customer service, you understand this person spiritually. Water management is basically customer service for crops. And crops do not leave polite reviews. One interpretation is that the earliest sense of fate in this landscape is practical. You can plan, but you cannot command the river. You can calculate, but you cannot guarantee rain. You can store grain, but you cannot stop pests. That tension between planning and uncertainty may have encouraged a worldview where hidden forces matter. Not necessarily hidden beings in spaceships, but hidden patterns in nature. Patterns that feel like personalities because they affect you, like personalities do. You keep walking until the city's main fields open out like a quilt. Furrows run in parallel lines. The earth looks dark and rich in places, pale and crusty in others. Someone bends to check a sprout. Someone else carries a basket and mutters about how the weeds are having a better year than the wheat. That is a truly ancient complaint. If whining were a technology, humanity would have reached the moon by now. Now your attention lifts, because the sky here is enormous, with no mountains to block it, no tall forests to curtain it. The heavens become a nightly performance. Archaeology suggests that Mesopotamian peoples observed the skies carefully, eventually developing sophisticated ways of tracking celestial cycles. Even if you only care about farming, you need to know seasons. You need to know when to plant. You need to know when floods usually come. A careful reading might suggest that the habit of watching the sky, generation after generation, shaped mythic language. It's possible that gods in the heavens are a way of speaking about predictable movements that still feel uncanny. You find a small open area, and a group of people is gathered around a low table with clay pieces and counting tokens. They are doing something that looks like math, because it is math. But the vibe is more like ritual than schoolwork. They count, they check, they verify. If you squint, you can see the roots of a base 60 system, the kind of counting that later echoes into how we measure time. 60 seconds, 60 minutes, circles divided into degrees. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian mathematics and timekeeping were highly developed, and that they influenced later cultures. The evidence we do have points to practical needs driving this, but it also points to something else, an appetite for order. Order becomes calendar. Calendar becomes coordination. Coordination becomes civilization. You imagine a priest or an official marking days, watching the moon's phases, noting when it crescents, when it fattens, when it vanishes. The moon is a clock you can see without owning one. And once you start tracking the moon, you start tracking other things too. The bright star that is not a star. The planet that wanders, the seasonal rising of constellations. From there, a whole vocabulary of meaning can grow. One interpretation is that when texts speak about divine decrees or cosmic laws, they may be echoing the experience of discovering dependable cycles. Not everything is dependable. The river can surprise you. A storm can ruin you. But some things return. The moon returns. The sun returns. The stars return to their places. And that returnsness might feel like a rule written into the universe itself. Now comes the gentle mystery thread, carefully labelled. A fringe idea proposes that intense sky observation could be interpreted by later readers as watching for someone, if you treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion. You can see why it appeals. The image is cinematic, priests on rooftops, scanning the night, waiting for a sign. But a more cautious explanation could be that they are waiting for the right time to sow, for the omen that supports a political decision, or for the festival date that keeps the community synchronized. The act looks mysterious because it is quiet and focused. Silence always feels like it is hiding something. You wander toward the edge of a neighborhood where rooftops are flat and accessible. Someone climbs a ladder with a basket. Another person sits with a small brazier. Warming hands. Up here, the city's noise softens into a murmur. The sky is a wide bowl, and the stars are scattered grain. You sit down, and you feel how easy it is to project stories onto the heavens. Humans do that with clouds, with coffee foam, with the pattern of stains on a wall. Give us a blank surface, and we will draw meaning on it like toddlers with a marker. And yet, the Sumerians are not just doodling. They are building a system of observation that becomes tradition. The evidence we do have points to a strong relationship between temples and knowledge work, including writing, and, later, astronomy and divination. Divination, in a mainstream sense, is not about guaranteed supernatural certainty. It is a cultural method of decision-making under uncertainty. You face a risky choice, you consult patterns, you give the choice a formal shape, and the community accepts the result. That acceptance is real power. This is where the phrase, Earth's shocking history, can become something grounded. It might be shocking to realize how early humans turned uncertainty into institutions, not by eliminating fear, but by managing it. A temple schedule, a calendar, a ritual, a list of omens. These are tools. They help people feel that the world is readable. You watch someone mark a tablet with small wedges, recording a delivery of barley. The list is simple, but it is also radical. Writing turns memory into an object. It lets decisions outlive the decider. It lets promises become enforceable. It lets debts linger like ghosts. And yes, if you have student loans, you're spiritually connected to this moment. The first written records are basically, "You owe me." And the rest of civilization says, "Sounds great. Let's scale that up." In the middle of this calm, you hear laughter. A group of kids is playing a chasing game between walls. Their feet slap the hard ground. One kid trips, stands up, and looks around as if the earth personally embarrassed him. That too is ancient and timeless. The city is not only priests and kings. It is families, neighbors, gossip, small joys. The mainstream anchor is simple. Sumerian society includes ordinary people doing ordinary things. And the archaeology of houses, tools, and food remains helps build that picture. You walk into a small courtyard where a woman is grinding grain on a stone. The rhythm is steady, almost meditative. You can hear the grain crackle, feel the dust. Nearby, a jar of beer rests in the shade. Beer is not a joke here. It is calories and safe liquid in a hot place, and it has a social life. The idea that early Mesopotamia had beer culture is widely accepted, and you can almost see friends gathering, passing a straw, talking about whose cousin is marrying whose cousin. Because if you think modern family drama is complicated, you should try a city-state with a few thousand people and no privacy. Now the quiet skies again. You look up and imagine how the city's lights are minimal. No neon, no street lamps. The stars are bright enough to make you feel small, and the Milky Way is a pale river overhead. If you are a scribe priest, you might connect the river above to the river below. One interpretation is that cosmic geography mirrors earthly geography. Heaven becomes a grand city. The gods become officials. The underworld becomes a shadowy bureaucracy. It's possible that people describe divine councils because councils are how their own world runs. And here, gently, the debate enters. Historians still argue whether the most elaborate mythic language in later texts should be read mainly as poetic religion, or partly as a coded memory of earlier cultural upheavals and contact with distant peoples. There is no full consensus, because myths are slippery. They carry more than one meaning at once. You stand and walk again, following a street toward a market area. Traders call out. Someone displays fish. Someone else offers dates and onions. A man argues over the weight of a sack, insisting the scale is cursed, or the merchant is, and the merchant replies with the ancient equivalent of, "Buddy, the scale is fine." Trade is another anchor on solid ground. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian cities depended on exchange, both local and long distance, because the land lacks certain resources like timber and stone. The The need to trade connects people, and connection spreads ideas. A careful reading might suggest that some mysterious outsider motifs in myths could be influenced by real encounters with foreigners. If your world is mostly flat fields and canals, a traveller from mountains might seem like they stepped out of another realm. If someone arrives with lapis lazuli or cedar, goods that feel almost magical, the person can start to feel magical too. And what if the origin of sky beings is sometimes just that? Someone from far away, showing up with knowledge and materials you do not have. But we keep it cautious. That is a possibility, not a certainty. It is suggestive, not conclusive. You pass a small shrine tucked into a wall, simple and intimate. Someone has left a bit of food. Someone has lit a tiny lamp. This is religion at the scale of a household, not an ideology for a king. It reminds you that even if temples are institutions, belief is also personal. People ask for protection. People ask for health. People ask for a good harvest. People ask for a child to sleep through the night. You smile at that one, because some prayers never go out of style. The sky grows deeper, and a breeze moves across the canals, carrying the soft sound of reeds knocking together. You listen to that sound, and it becomes a kind of metronome. The city's life is measured by rhythms, water flow, moon cycles, work schedules, festival days. The calmness is not accidental. It is built. And here comes a cinematic what if, placed gently on top of the solid ground. What if the most dramatic arrival in this landscape is not an external being at all, but the arrival of predictable time? Once you can count days and track months and anticipate seasons. You step into a new kind of mind. You are no longer only reacting. You are forecasting. You are planning. That shift can feel like a doorway opening. It can feel like someone handed humanity a map. And maybe that is why later stories speak of gifts from the divine. Because receiving a calendar, receiving a way to measure, receiving a way to organize, feels like receiving fire. You cannot see the giver, but you see the effect. You keep walking, letting your footsteps fall into the soft hush of the night. A distant drum taps a slow pattern, maybe for a ritual, maybe for someone practicing, maybe because somebody simply likes the sound. The fan hum in your room can merge with it, and your breathing can match it, and your thoughts can soften. You are left with a calm, grounded shock. Humans in this land did not wait for meaning to arrive. They manufactured meaning out of mud and starlight. They carved order into water. They wrote time into clay. And if you want to let your imagination float, you can. But you do it with labels, with care, with the gentle understanding that mystery is not a certificate of truth. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You look up one more time, and the sky does not answer. It simply shines. And that is enough to keep the mind wandering while the body relaxes. You follow the river downstream until the banks widen and the water looks deceptively calm, like it's trying to act innocent. The surface carries moonlight in broken pieces, and the current murmurs to itself, a steady sound that can lull you into thinking the world is gentle. Then you notice the debris snagged in reeds, the way the shoreline is uneven, the scars where water has bitten into the earth. This place has moods. It always has. What's broadly accepted is that the Tigris and Euphrates river system can produce floods that reshape settlements, and that ancient communities in the region experienced destructive high water events. Archaeology suggests that some sites show flood deposits in their layers, though the timing and extent vary from place to place. The evidence we do have points to repeated flooding as part of life. Not a single neat event that happened once and then politely left the stage. You stand at a low spot near the bank, and you imagine how quickly things could change. A day of heavy rain upstream, a sudden surge, a canal gate failing, a levee cut by desperate hands to save one field at the cost of another. Disaster does not always arrive as thunder. Sometimes it arrives as paperwork and bad decisions. You step into an imagined street that still feels damp, even in memory. Walls have collapsed into mud. Pots are half buried. A doorway is clogged with silt. Nobody is here, because this is a moment frozen, the kind of moment that later becomes story. And you can feel why. A flood is not only damage. A flood is humiliation. You built a city. You organized labor. You stacked grain. You made schedules. You did everything right. And then water walks through your plans like it owns the place. Now you meet the mainstream anchor that matters for tonight. Mesopotamian literature includes flood narratives, and scholars often discuss how these stories relate to local river realities. One interpretation is that repeated floods, combined with the human habit of turning trauma into meaning, helped form the emotional core of these tales. It's possible that the flood story is not a documentary report, but a mythic compression, taking many floods and many fears and shaping them into a single dramatic memory. You walk into a temple courtyard where people gather with the tense, quiet urgency that happens after a catastrophe. Someone is counting survivors. Someone is checking the granary. Someone is arguing about whether to rebuild here or move to higher ground. A priest is offering words that sound comforting, even if nobody knows what comfort means today. You notice how the community's response is practical and sacred at the same time. That blend is normal. When people can't control the world, they try to control the story. A careful reading might suggest that flood myths also serve political purposes. If your city claims its god saved it, that is a statement of superiority. If your king claims he restored order after chaos, that is legitimacy. A more cautious explanation could be that these narratives teach moral lessons about humility, obedience, and the fragility of human plans. In other words, the flood story can be a warning wrapped in poetry. You listen to an elder telling children about water rising, about boats, about animals, about a family surviving, because they listen to a divine instruction. The children's eyes are wide, their mouths are sticky with dates. They are terrified and thrilled, because that's how stories work. And you realize something quietly shocking. A disaster story is also entertainment. It's how humans practice fear in a safe space. It's how you prepare your mind for chaos while your body sits in relative calm. Now the mystery thread, clearly labeled. A popular rumor claims that flood accounts are actually descriptions of global cataclysms, or even engineered events tied to unknown forces. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because it makes the story bigger than the local landscape, and humans love bigger. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can still explore a gentler question. What if some flood imagery reflects not only rivers, but also coastlines shifting after the last ice age, when sea levels rose and communities adapted? That idea is not a single neat answer either, but it is a plausible backdrop for why water might feel like history's great eraser. But we keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The evidence is patchy, and different flood deposits mean different things at different sites. That's the honest truth. And honesty is soothing, because it lets you stop fighting reality. You move into a small archive room in your imagination, where tablets are stacked or stored. Some are cracked, some are worn smooth at the edges. You picture a scribe copying an older tale, adjusting phrases, polishing it, making it fit a new audience. This is how literature lives. It changes. It adapts. It keeps the emotional truth even when the details shift. One interpretation is that flood narratives evolve over time, shaped by new political needs and new religious ideas, while still echoing the same primal fear. The world can rise up and take your house. Historians still argue whether specific Mesopotamian flood traditions should be connected tightly to particular archaeological flood layers, or read more broadly as mythic storytelling inspired by the region's river dynamics. That debate is not a buzzkill. It is a flashlight. It helps you see that a story can be meaningful without being a newspaper report. You step back outside, and the night air feels cooler. The river's voice is steady again. You walk along the embankment and notice how people have reinforced it with reed bundles and packed earth. They are trying, always trying, to negotiate with water. That negotiation produces culture. It produces laws about canals and property. It produces rituals asking the gods for restraint. It produces a kind of humility that is practical, not philosophical. You wander toward a workshop where someone is making a small model boat, maybe as a toy, maybe as an offering. The shape is simple, but it's enough to float. You watch the maker test it in a shallow basin, pushing it gently. The boat rocks, steadies, and you can feel relief. The boat is not only a thing, it is a promise that you can survive a world that changes. Now you take a turn into the realm of symbols, because symbols are where myth gets its power. Water can mean chaos. Dry land can mean order. A boat can mean the fragile boundary between life and death. Animals can mean the continuity of the world. A chosen survivor can mean the continuity of the community. A careful reading might suggest that flood stories are less about punishment and more about reset, the way a farmer burns a field or clears it to plant again. It's possible that the flood is a cosmic version of clearing and replanting. But you stay calm, because this is bedtime history, not a courtroom. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And the evidence for deeper metaphysical meanings is always interpretive, because we are reading human minds across millennia. You walk into a rebuilt street, because humans rebuild. Doors are repaired, walls are raised again. A new kiln fires. The smell of baking bread returns like a miracle. A child laughs in a puddle. Somebody complains about mud. Somebody else complains about the complainer. Because complaining is the most renewable resource on Earth. This is another shock. And it's mainstream. Resilience is ancient. Cities were not one-time experiments. They were persistent habits. People learned from floods. improved canal systems, moved structures, reinforced embankments, adjusted schedules. The evidence we do have points to long-term occupation and repeated reconstruction at major sites. You can almost see the layers like pages in a book. Each flood and rebuild a paragraph. Now the cinematic what if, carefully framed. What if the most haunting part of these flood stories is not the water itself, but the silence afterward? Imagine dawn after the surge, when the sky is pale and the river has retreated, leaving a mirror of wet mud. No birdsong yet, no market calls, just the sound of dripping and distant crying. In that silence, a person might feel that the world ended and restarted. And if you feel that once, you might tell it as the world ended. Even if it was only your world, your street, your family, that is how local catastrophe becomes cosmic narrative. You walk to a high point, a slightly raised mound where you can see the river and the city. You imagine a council meeting, elders and officials deciding how to ration grain, how to rebuild canals, how to keep people from leaving. These decisions are the real drama of civilization, not the sword fight, not the thunderbolt, but the spreadsheet, the labor roster, the ration list. The temple scribes record it. The records survive. They are unglamorous. And they are also the reason we know anything. A fringe idea proposes that the precision of some ancient descriptions, measurements, and lists hints at knowledge that arrived from an outside source. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it can be interesting as a thought experiment. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can ask, what if outside source sometimes means outside the city, not outside the planet? Knowledge can travel with traders, migrants, and intermarriage. People move, and ideas move faster. You step into a small shrine where an offering bowl has been refilled. A lamp flickers. The flame is tiny, stubborn. It doesn't care about floods. It just burns. You can feel why humans keep lighting lamps. It makes a small circle of certainty. It tells the night, you can be big, but I can still make light. You leave the shrine and walk along a canal that has been cleared again. The water looks tame in this narrow channel, but you respect it more now. The story is not that humans are powerless. The story is that humans are always in relationship with forces larger than them, and their response is to build systems, tell stories, and keep going. The river's murmur becomes a lullaby. You let your breathing match it, and you let the flood narrative, with all its gravity, settle into a calmer meaning. It is a memory of vulnerability, shaped into a lesson, carried forward in clay and voice. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, and in that space between. You can let your mind float, because you don't have to decide. You just have to drift. You step into a courtyard where the air feels drier, as if the city itself is holding its breath. In the center, a stone bowl sits empty, catching starlight. Nearby, a scribe is kneeling over a fresh clay tablet, smoothing the surface with the flat of a hand until it looks like a quiet pond. The stylus begins to tap, making small wedge impressions with a steady rhythm. Tap, press, lift, tap, press, lift. If your brain likes repetitive sounds, congratulations, you have just found the ancient ASMR channel. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian kingship became a central organizing force in many city-states, and that kings used inscriptions and lists to define legitimacy and continuity. Among the famous documents often discussed is the Sumerian king list, a text that presents a sequence of dynasties and rulers, sometimes with reign lengths that stretch into astonishing numbers. Most historians agree that this kind of list mixes historical memory with ideology. It is not simply a neutral timeline. It is a political story dressed as a record. You watch the scribe's careful hands and imagine the mind behind the list. A list is a powerful thing. It looks calm, orderly, objective. It makes chaos sit in a line. It makes leadership look inevitable. And in a world that floods, warps, and shifts, inevitability is a comforting illusion. You walk closer, and the scribe seems to be writing names that carry weight. Some are familiar because they survived in later traditions. Some are strange, shaped by a language you can't quite pronounce without feeling like you might accidentally summon a goat. The scribe pauses to check an older tablet, then continues. You realize this is not one person's invention. It is a tradition, copied, updated, argued over. The evidence we do have points to multiple versions of king lists and related inscriptions, which suggests active editing and political use. Now you look at the most tempting part, the long reigns, the exaggerated lifespans, the numbers that feel like they belong to giants, not humans. Here is where you keep the truth ladder gentle. Documented. The list contains unusually long reign lengths in early sections. Interpreted. One interpretation is that these numbers are symbolic, using large figures to signal a distant age or to elevate certain lineages. Imagined. What if the numbers are like a fog bank, deliberately thick, making the earliest times feel unreachable, so the present rulers can claim they stand at the end of a sacred chain? One interpretation is that the earliest segment of such lists may function like mythic prehistory, not like modern history. It's possible that enormous reigns are not meant to be read literally as birthdays and death dates, but as a kind of time math. Numbers can be language. They can be metaphor. They can also be propaganda that says, our kingship is ancient, therefore our authority is natural. You find yourself staring at a sequence that implies a world where early rulers reigned for thousands of years. Your mind wants to leap. It wants to say, aha, non-human rulers. That leap is exactly why rumors thrive. A fringe idea proposes that these long reigns indicate beings who are not ordinary humans, sometimes connected in popular imagination to the Anunnaki. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it is common in modern retellings because it gives a thrilling answer to a numerical puzzle. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Because bedtime history should be cozy, not careless. The mainstream scholarly approach is that the list is a literary and political document, and that its earliest numbers are not reliable as literal chronology. That's a possibility, not a certainty. But it's a strong one, because the list's purpose appears ideological. A more cautious explanation could be that these reigns reflect a mixture of symbolic exaggeration, scribal tradition, and attempts to compress time. The evidence is suggestive, not conclusive, and different scholars weigh the list's reliability differently for different periods. You step back and look at the city around you. Kingship is not only a crown, it is logistics. The king is a war leader, a judge, a builder, a ritual participant. The palace is an economic machine: taxes, labor, construction, diplomacy. Most historians agree that rulers used monumental projects and religious patronage to consolidate power. That means texts about kings are rarely just about kings. They are about systems. You drift into a palace courtyard where columns cast long shadows. Servants move quietly. Officials carry tablets. Someone argues about grain allocation in a tone that says the argument has been going on for weeks. There is no sword fight here, just bureaucracy and bruised pride. If you've ever watched two people argue over meeting minutes, you are prepared for this. Now you notice how kingship and divinity intertwine. In Mesopotamian ideology, kings often presented themselves as chosen by the gods, sometimes as shepherds of the people, sometimes as builders who restore order. A careful reading might suggest that claims like kingship descended from heaven are not meant to describe a physical descent, but a sacred authorization. It's possible that heaven, in this context, is a way of saying, not up for debate, and yet debate always exists. Historians still argue whether early kings in southern Mesopotamia were primarily temple administrators who became secular rulers, or whether kingship emerged through military leadership that later merged with temple authority. The evidence is complex, and you can feel the truth in that complexity. Power rarely has one origin story. It has several, braided together. You walk through a scribal room where students practice writing names and numbers. One student is clearly bored, another is overconfident. The teacher looks like someone who has watched 1,000 young minds try to cheat their way through arithmetic. The student presses wedges into clay. A name, a number, a place. This is how power becomes permanent. If it is written, it can be enforced. If it is written, it can be remembered. If it is written, it can also be rewritten. That last part is important, and it's where you keep your curiosity awake without turning it into certainty. One interpretation is that king lists can be edited to emphasize certain dynasties and downplay others. A more cautious explanation could be that scribes copied older texts with mistakes, adjustments, or local preferences. Either way, the list becomes a living artifact, not a fixed truth. Now the cinematic what if, carefully framed. What if a scribe, tired and half asleep, pressed the wrong wedge, turning a modest number into a giant one? What if a small scribal slip echoed through centuries, copied again and again, until the earliest kings became near immortal in the imagination? It's a funny thought, and also a humbling one. Civilization is sturdy, but it is also built by humans with tired hands. You move to a public square where a herald recites a lineage. Names roll out like a drumbeat. The crowd listens, because lineage is identity. If you know who ruled, you know who you are. If you know where kingship traveled, you know which city deserves respect. The list is not just a timeline. It is a map of prestige. You notice another quiet truth. These texts do not only elevate rulers, they also reveal anxiety. If you have to insist your authority is ancient and divinely chosen, it might be because you know people could disagree. The more loudly you claim inevitability, the more you fear instability. and instability is always nearby in a landscape of shifting rivers and rival city-states. A popular rumor claims that hidden codes in rain lengths point to lost cycles, advanced calendars, or secret astronomical periods. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it has a certain charm. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can still enjoy the idea that scribes loved numbers enough to play with them. Mesopotamian numeracy was real and sophisticated. It's possible that some numerical patterns reflect scribal conventions, sacred numerology, or attempts to align dynasties with cosmic order. But again, solid ground first. The evidence we do have points to a mixture of accurate and inaccurate elements. Some kings named in such traditions likely correspond to real historical rulers. Others may be legendary or symbolic. The list is most useful when handled with care, not when treated as a literal transcript of deep time. You drift toward a temple where a statue stands, eyes wide and still. The king approaches with offerings, because public piety is political. The crowd watches. A ritual is performed. The king's role is confirmed not only by force, but by performance. Archaeology suggests that religious and political life were deeply intertwined. The temple is the stage, and the king is one of the main actors. Now you let your mind rest on a calmer realization. The shocking part is not that the past is full of impossible ages. The shock is that humans built narratives that reach backward beyond reliable memory, and they did it with intention. They created an ancientness, a deep past, a mythic depth that made the present feel rooted. That instinct is universal. People today do it too, just with different props. You step away from the scribe's tablet and let the courtyard's quiet settle around you. A breeze stirs dust. Somewhere, a bell-like sound rings, maybe a tool striking pottery, maybe a distant ritual instrument. The sound repeats softly, and you can let it become the rhythm of your breathing. And if your mind tries to pull the list into a literal alien timeline, you smile and guide it back gently. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The safest way to enjoy the puzzle is to hold it like a smooth stone in your palm. Feel its weight, admire its shape, and not insist that it must be a key to a single locked door. You walk out into the night, and the city feels both grand and fragile. Kings rise, kings fall. Lists are written, lists are revised. The clay hardens, the names remain, and you, wandering through it with sleepy curiosity, don't need to solve the numbers to feel the ancient heartbeat inside them. You slip into the cool shadow of a massive storage room where the air smells like dried grain and sun-baked clay. Rows of large jars sit like silent guards. Baskets are stacked with careful gaps for airflow, because even ancient people knew that if you pack things too tight, the universe responds with mold. A worker moves down the aisle, tapping jar rims, listening for cracks. Another carries a small tablet, checking marks, counting, verifying. This is sacred space in a surprisingly practical sense. It is where calories become civilization. Archaeology suggests that temples in many Sumerian city-states functioned as economic centers, managing land, labor, and stored goods. What's broadly accepted is that these institutions were not only places of worship, but also administrative hubs. The evidence we do have points to systems of rationing and redistribution, and to the presence of specialized roles, scribes, supervisors, craftsmen, herders, boatmen, and the people who do the unglamorous work of keeping everything from falling apart. You walk past a group of laborers receiving rations. A supervisor calls out names. Someone gets barley. Someone gets oil. Someone complains their portion is small, and the supervisor gives them a look that says, "Take it up with the gods," which is basically the ancient version of "please contact support." The scene is mundane, but it is also a key to understanding why the divine language in texts can feel so managerial. If the temple controls food, the temple's god feels like the one who controls food. The line between institution and deity becomes thin, not because people are foolish, but because the system is real. One interpretation is that when myths describe gods assigning duties or establishing orders, the language may mirror how temple life assigns duties and establishes orders. It's possible that cosmic administration is a reflection of earthly administration. The universe looks like a well-run storeroom, at least in the stories, because a well-run storeroom is the difference between surviving winter and not surviving winter. You wander into a workshop attached to the temple complex. A potter's wheel spins. A metalworker hammers a piece of copper with a rhythmic ping that feels like it could hypnotize you. A weaver runs fingers along threads, checking tension. The city hums with specialized skills. Most historians agree that early urban life supported craft specialization, and that temples and palaces played big roles in organizing production. You notice a fascinating thing. A craft is both work and mystery. To a farmer, a metalworker might seem like a magician, turning dull stone into sharp blades, shaping glowing material, controlling fire. Fire is always a little theatrical, and when a culture writes myths about divine craftsmen or gods who shape the world, a careful reading might suggest that human craft knowledge influences those images. It's possible that some creation language is inspired by artisans who literally shape clay, bake it hard, and give it purpose. Now you reach a corner where a group of priestly officials is preparing for a ritual, but it looks like a meeting. They are checking lists, rehearsing chants, aligning offerings. They discuss timing. They discuss who stands where. They discuss the order of procession. This is religion as choreography. The mainstream anchor is that Sumerian religious life involved rituals, hymns, and offerings centered around temples and deities. The evidence we do have points to regular festivals and structured roles within temple hierarchies. You step outside into a courtyard where a small platform holds an offering table. Someone places bread. Someone pours beer. Someone lights incense. The smoke lifts slowly, curling in the air like it's trying to draw letters no one can read. The moment is quiet, and you feel the human tenderness in it. People are asking for stability. They are asking for good water, good health, good berths, safe travel. Their hopes are not exotic. They are familiar. But the temple has another job too, knowledge. You move into a small room where a priest scribe is watching the sky through a doorway, not with a telescope, obviously, but with attention. They have a tablet nearby, and they scratch notes. The stars are not just pretty, they are signs. In later Mesopotamian traditions, celestial omens become a major system. Even in earlier periods, it's possible that observation and interpretation were part of the temple's prestige. One interpretation is that the temple's authority grows partly because it claims the world is readable. If you can read clay, and you can read the sky, you become the person who reads reality. That's power. A more cautious explanation could be that this is simply an early form of data collection and pattern recognition, mixed with cultural meaning. Either way, it makes the priestly class feel like intermediaries between ordinary life and the larger cosmos. Historians still argue whether the rise of priestly knowledge in Mesopotamia is primarily a religious development or an administrative one, meaning whether theology drives the system or the system drives the theology. There's no full consensus, and honestly, it might be both. Humans are good at building feedback loops. A temple gains power. Power demands explanation. Explanation increases reverence. Reverence increases power. You can almost hear the gears turning. Now the mystery thread, carefully framed. A fringe idea proposes that references to heavenly messages, divine tablets of destiny, or decrees written by gods could hint at something more literal, like advanced communication or technology. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because the imagery is so vivid. Cosmic paperwork. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can still enjoy the mood. The idea of the universe having an archive, a filing cabinet of fate, is both eerie and comforting. It suggests someone is in charge, even if that someone is a metaphor. You walk to a place where animals are kept. Sheep bleat softly. Goats stare at you with that suspicious, judgmental look goats have perfected. A herder counts them, and you can almost see the tally marks on a tablet. Most historians agree that animal husbandry was integral to Sumerian economy. The temple's involvement in herding is documented through administrative records. This is not myth. This is paperwork again. And yes, paperwork is the true monster of history, but a safe one. You watch the herder guide animals toward water, and you notice how the economy is a web. Grain feeds people. People feed animals. Animals provide wool. Wool becomes cloth. Cloth becomes trade goods. Trade brings copper, stone, timber. Those materials support tools and buildings. Buildings support institutions. Institutions support writing. Writing supports everything. It is all connected, like threads on a loom. A careful reading might suggest that when myths say humans were created to work for the gods, the image reflects this labor-centered reality. It's possible that the notion of serving divine beings is also a way of talking about serving institutions, serving the temple, serving the city. That does not make the myth cynical. It makes it honest about how life feels. Most people work. Most people answer to someone. Myth can turn that into a cosmic story so it feels meaningful. You step into a bakery area where loaves are being shaped and slid into an oven. The smell is warm and sweet. Someone brushes flour off their hands and laughs at a joke. The joke is probably about someone's cousin, because that is always the safest category of comedy. You smile, because history is not only big ideas. It is bread smell and small laughter. Now the cinematic what if, placed softly on top of the documented world. What if the temple storeroom is also a metaphor from memory? jars sealed, goods measured, records kept. In a sense, the city is building a mind outside the body, a communal brain made of clay tablets. And what if later stories about divine knowledge are an echo of this feeling? That information is power, and power is almost supernatural. You wander into a scribal schoolroom. A student is copying a hymn, another is copying a list, another is practicing signs and getting them slightly wrong. The teacher taps the tablet and corrects the wedge angle, because even ancient teachers had the "know like this" energy. The mainstream anchor is that scribal education existed and produced standardized writing practices. The evidence we do have includes many school tablets with repeated exercises. A popular rumor claims that scribal schools preserved forbidden knowledge about beings from the sky, hidden in plain sight in the writing system. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. But as a mood, it's easy to understand why people imagine it. A room full of trained readers feels like a secret society to anyone who cannot read. Literacy is a gate. Gates always attract rumors. You step back into the courtyard and watch a procession begin. Priests carry offerings, musicians play a steady beat. The crowd follows. The movement is slow, almost soothing, like a river of people. Ritual has a sleepy quality when you are not the one responsible for timing. If you are responsible for timing, ritual is basically event management with divine consequences, which is terrifying. Somebody is sweating under their robe, guaranteed. You notice that the temple's power is both soft and hard. Soft in the form of songs, festivals, and meaning. Hard in the form of stored grain, labor control, and written records. This blend helps explain why Sumerian texts can feel like they speak from a world where gods are administrators and administrators are sacred. And yet, you do not have to flatten it into one explanation. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The evidence we do have points to genuine religious devotion as well as political structure. Human hearts can hold both. People can believe deeply and also live inside systems. Those truths do not cancel each other. They coexist like firelight and shadow. You breathe in the night air. You hear the soft bleat of sheep and the faint rhythm of distant drums. You let those sounds become your lullaby. The city's sacred economy keeps moving quietly, and your mind can rest in the thought that the most shocking secret is sometimes simple. Civilization is built from storage rooms, schedules, and stories that make work feel like it matters. You wander into a quiet courtyard where a shallow basin reflects the sky like a dark eye. A breeze slides through, barely moving the surface, and the reflection ripples as if the heavens are breathing. On the wall, someone has painted simple symbols, not full writing, more like marks that feel personal. Nearby, a small statue stands in a niche, hands clasped, eyes wide, the expression of someone who's eternally polite and slightly worried. Honestly, it's the same face you make when you open your bank app. What's broadly accepted is that Sumerian religion included a pantheon with major deities associated with sky, wind, water, fertility, and city patronage. Names like An, Enlil, and Enki appear across Sumerian myths and hymns. and their roles can shift depending on the text and the city's traditions. The evidence we do have points to a rich, evolving religious landscape, rather than a single fixed theology. You step toward a small shrine where a priest is arranging offerings. The priest's movements are slow and careful, like they're trying not to wake the air. You listen to murmured words, not loud proclamations. This is important. In many ancient cultures, the divine is not treated like a superhero. The divine is treated like weather. You respect it. You negotiate with it. You feed it. Not because it eats bread like a person, but because feeding is a language of relationship. Now you let yourself meet the names as ideas, not as literal biography. An is often framed as a sky authority, a distant high god in some traditions. Enlil is often connected to wind, breath, storms, and kingship, the kind of power that can bless or blow your roof off. Enki is often tied to fresh water, wisdom, craft, and clever solutions, the kind of mind that finds a loophole when the universe says no. Most historians agree these are gods within a religious system, shaped by geography, politics, and cultural memory. That is the documented anchor. One interpretation is that these divine roles mirror the realities of life in southern Mesopotamia. Sky matters because it signals seasons. Wind matters because it brings storms or relief. Fresh water matters because it is life, especially in a land where saltwater intrusion and drought can threaten fields. It's possible that gods are personified forces, a way to make nature negotiable through ritual and story. But you also notice something else. These gods are not only nature, they are society. Enlil is not just wind, but authority. Enki is not just water, but expertise. A careful reading might suggest that the pantheon also reflects human power structures, councils, hierarchies, rivalries, treaties. Myth can be a theatre where cities project their political anxieties into divine drama. You walk into a temple library room where a scribe reads aloud from a tablet to a small group. The listeners lean in, eyes half-lidded, because oral storytelling has that sleepy cadence even when the content is cosmic. The scribe speaks of assemblies of gods, decisions made, fates assigned. The language feels official. It feels like minutes from a meeting. If you've ever sat through a long meeting, you know the divine might be real, because only something beyond human comprehension would invent meetings on purpose. Now the tricky word that people love to pull into the spotlight, Anunnaki. In many Sumerian and later Mesopotamian contexts, this term is used for a group associated with the gods, sometimes described as divine offspring or members of a divine assembly. What's broadly accepted is that this is mythological language within a religious worldview. The evidence we do have does not require a reading of the Anunnaki as literal extraterrestrials. That said, the term's usage can vary across periods and texts, which gives it that slippery, intriguing quality. One interpretation is that Anunnaki works like a category label, a way of saying those divine ones involved in the big decisions. It's possible that different storytellers use the term differently, and that later audiences expanded its meaning. This flexibility is one reason modern rumor can attach itself so easily. A word that shifts becomes a hook for speculation. Now the mystery thread, clearly labeled. A fringe idea proposes that references to gods coming down, divine beings arriving, or assemblies in the heavens, are coded memories of contact with non-human visitors. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin when you look for direct, technical descriptions. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can still explore why it feels tempting. The imagery is cinematic, descending beings, shining authority, knowledge given, humans serving. It sounds like a sci-fi trailer written in clay. A more cautious explanation could be that coming down is ritual language. The god's presence is invoked into a statue or a temple. The divine arrives during a festival. The god's seat is established in a city. In that sense, arrival is not a spaceship moment. It is a ceremonial moment. The community experiences it as arrival because it changes behavior and meaning. You step outside into a street lined with small household shrines. A mother sets a tiny offering. A child imitates her, placing a pebble like it's precious. That small act tells you something huge. Religion is not only elite ideology, it is a daily habit, and daily habits shape language. If you speak to the gods every day, the gods become part of your vocabulary for explaining everything. Historians still argue whether the most ancient layers of Mesopotamian myth preserve traces of earlier, pre-urban beliefs from the region, or whether urban temple culture largely reshaped and standardized older traditions. There's no full consensus because the earliest oral layers are invisible to us. Writing appears after people have been believing and storytelling for a very long time. You wander into a place where city walls rise, thick and protective. You can feel why cities would want patron gods. A wall can be breached. A god feels harder to breach, at least emotionally. In myths, gods fight, negotiate, punish, bless. But in everyday life, the god is the city's identity. Our god protects us is the ancient version of wearing a team jersey. It's loyalty, pride, community, and a little bit of we're better than your city, which is timeless. Now you listen to a hymn, low and rhythmic. The words praise a deity for establishing order, for granting kingship, for keeping the world from slipping into chaos. A careful reading might suggest that order here means many things at once: stable water, stable harvest, stable leadership, stable social rules. The divine becomes the story you tell about stability. A popular rumor claims that certain names in the pantheon are actually titles for outsiders, not gods, and that the myths are misread records of historical events. This theory isn't widely accepted, and it often relies on selective interpretation. But, as a bedtime thought experiment, it can still be approached safely. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can ask, what if ancient people sometimes mythologized real leaders or foreign powers, transforming them into divine characters over generations? That happens in many cultures. Humans turn impressive strangers into legends, especially when details fade. You step into a canal-side garden where fresh water pools, fed by a channel. The water is clear compared to the silty river, and fish flicker in it. You think of Enki, the freshwater god in many traditions, and you feel how a deity can be anchored to a real, tangible resource. Freshwater is wisdom because it sustains. It is cleverness because it finds pathways. It is mercy because it arrives when salt threatens crops. In a land where water quality can decide life. A water god feels like a genius. Now the cinematic what if, softly framed. What if the gods are also the mind's way of giving personality to the invisible systems that shape life? The canal network, the temple economy, the king's authority, the seasonal cycles. You cannot hug a bureaucracy. You cannot argue with a calendar. But you can argue with a god. You can plead. You can bargain. You can perform rituals. You can feel less helpless. In that sense, the pantheon is psychological technology, not in a cynical way, but in a deeply human way. You sit by the basin again, watching the reflection of the stars ripple. The world feels both simple and layered. Simple because people need water and food. Layered because people also need meaning. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The evidence we do have points to a sophisticated religious culture that was also deeply practical. And if your mind still wants the thrill, you can let it have a small, safe thrill. The idea that words like Anunnaki are doors with more than one room behind them. One room is mainstream myth and religion. Another room is modern reinterpretation and rumor. Another room is your own imagination, which is allowed to wander as long as it carries a lantern labeled maybe. You stand and walk out into the night, letting the city's murmurs fade into a soft hush. The stars keep their distance. The water keeps its quiet motion. The names of gods linger like echoes, not as proof, but as poetry. And poetry is sometimes the gentlest way to hold a mystery without squeezing it into a false shape. You step into a small, smoky room where a lump of wet clay sits on a low table like a quiet heart. A craftswoman presses her thumbs into it, turning it slowly, shaping a shallow bowl. The clay takes fingerprints without complaint. It is patient. Nearby, a child watches with the intense seriousness children reserve for anything messy. In the corner, a brazier glows, and the room smells like warm earth and ash, the scent of something becoming permanent. What's broadly accepted is that Sumerian and broader Mesopotamian myths include creation stories, where humans are fashioned from clay and given life through divine action, often with a purpose tied to labor and service. The evidence we do have comes from literary texts and later copies, and scholars discuss how these narratives reflect the societies that produced them. These are not laboratory notes. They are meaning-making stories, shaped by culture. You watch the clay bowl form, and you understand why clay becomes the material of creation in myth. Clay is everywhere. Clay is what the land gives you. Clay becomes bricks, jars, tablets in them, seals, ovens. Clay holds water. Clay holds grain. Clay holds words. If you lived in a landscape built from mud, you might naturally imagine the human body as another crafted vessel. One interpretation is that made from clay is a poetic way of saying humans are shaped, like tools, and connected to the earth in a direct, tactile way. A careful reading might suggest that creation myths also express social expectations. If the story says humans were made to work for the gods, it may reflect a labor-organized society where most people's lives involve duty. It's possible that work for the gods also means work for the temple, work for the city, work for the king. The myth elevates ordinary labor into a cosmic role. It says, your effort is part of the universe's order, which is both comforting and, honestly, a little manipulative. The universe is basically saying, please keep showing up to your shift. You move outside to a courtyard where people are mixing straw into mud, making bricks. They tread the mixture with bare feet, slow and rhythmic. Like a dance no one asked to learn. Bricks are laid in rows. Walls rise. A city is literally assembled by human bodies pressing mud into shape. This is mainstream and simple. Archaeology shows mud brick construction as fundamental in Mesopotamia. The evidence we do have is everywhere in the ruins. Now you enter a quiet temple room where a priest recites a myth. The voice is steady, almost hypnotic, and the words paint images of divine beings consulting, deciding, creating. The story speaks of shaping and breathing and assigning roles. You let the tone wash over you, because bedtime history is about mood as much as information. The story might be about origins, but it's also about reassurance. The world has a structure. There is a reason you exist. Even if that reason is to carry baskets, it's still a reason. Historians still argue whether these creation narratives primarily reflect theological beliefs, or whether they function more as social ideology that justifies the structure of labor and authority. There's no full consensus, because myths can serve multiple purposes at once. They can be sincere belief and social reinforcement simultaneously. Humans are good at that. Now the mystery thread, carefully framed. A fringe idea proposes that creation from clay could be read as a veiled reference to something like engineered life, with clay symbolizing material science or genetic manipulation. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin for literal biotechnology in these texts. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so, but as a cinematic possibility, it has appeal. The image of unseen makers shaping a creature from raw material is timeless, and modern minds sometimes translate that into modern terms. A more cautious explanation could be that clay is metaphor and craft. Humans see themselves reflected in what they do. Potters make pots. Brickmakers make bricks. Bakers shape dough. So the gods in stories do the same, shaping humans as if humans are another kind of vessel. That interpretation stays closer to the documented cultural context, and it still leaves space for wonder. You walk to a riverbank where someone is washing clay from their hands. The water turns cloudy, carrying the fine particles away. You think about breath in myths, the idea of life entering matter. Breath is invisible and essential. You cannot hold it. You can only feel it. That makes it a perfect symbol for spirit. One interpretation is that divine breath is a way of speaking about the mystery of consciousness, the spark that makes a body feel like a person. Even today, people struggle to explain that spark without turning to metaphor. You pass by a midwife's house because birth is the most direct creation humans experience. The door is partly open. Inside, women speak softly. A lamp glows. Herbs hang from a beam. The scene is tender, not dramatic. This is another mainstream anchor. Family life, birth, and household rituals were central to ancient communities. The evidence we do have comes indirectly through archaeology and texts about domestic concerns. And you can feel why creation myths matter to people who see life begin with bloodless mystery and breathy cries. Now you enter a scribal room where a student copies lines about humans, gods, and destiny. The student pauses, frowns, and scratches the wrong wedge away while the clay is still soft. You smile, because even sacred cosmology has typos. There's comfort in that. It reminds you that what survives is a human product, even when it speaks in divine voices. You watch the student write about purpose. In some myths, humans are made to relieve the gods of labor. That idea can sound harsh, like humans are our tools. But one interpretation is gentler. The myth acknowledges that labor is the foundation of life. Work is how fields become food. Work is how canals stay open. Work is how children eat. The myth turns that into a cosmic contract. You work, and the gods maintain order. Whether that contract feels comforting or oppressive depends on your mood, and maybe on whether you had a good day at your own job. A popular rumor claims that ancient texts describe an original, more powerful version of humanity, and that later, humans are diminished after some conflict or change. This theory isn't widely accepted, and it often blends stories from different times and genres. But if we treat it as a possibility, rather than a conclusion, we can explore a calmer idea. Myths sometimes speak of ages, declines, or lost golden times, because people always feel the present is heavier than the past. Things used to be better is not only a modern complaint. It is ancient too. You wander into a garden where someone is shaping a small figurine from clay, perhaps an offering, perhaps a protective charm. The figure is simple, with wide eyes and a rounded body. It looks like it could be afraid of everything and still show up anyway, which is also very human. The act of making of figurines is a quiet kind of magic. You shape an object. You invest it with meaning. You place it somewhere to watch over a doorway, whether or not it truly protects. It changes how you feel, and feeling is part of survival. Now the cinematic what-if, carefully framed. What if the makers in the myth are not literal outsiders, but the many hands that make a human possible? Parents, midwives, nurses, elders, teachers, scribes. A child is shaped by a community the way clay is shaped by repeated touches. The myth compresses all those touches into a single divine act, because it is easier to tell a story that way. It is more dramatic. It is also more soothing. A single source of life feels stable in a world that often isn't. You sit for a moment by a kiln as it cools. The heat radiates gently. The crackle of cooling clay is tiny and rhythmic. You can let it become your lullaby. The kiln is an important symbol too. It turns soft clay into hard ceramic. It turns temporary into lasting. Writing on clay becomes permanent when fired. A city built of bricks becomes more durable when baked. And myths written down become harder to change, even if people keep reinterpreting them. You think about that. Writing makes stories solid, but interpretation keeps them alive. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The evidence we do have points to a culture deeply familiar with craft and labor, and that familiarity flows into its origin stories. Now you let your mind hover near the word arrival again, but you keep it soft. If someone insists the myth proves literal makers from elsewhere, that is an overreach. That's a possibility, not a certainty. The safer, calmer view is that humans used the materials of their lives to explain themselves. Clay, breath, work, order, those are the ingredients. The story is the recipe. You stand, brush dust from your hands, and step back into the night air. The sky is vast, and the city's lights are small. You can feel the quiet humility of being made of earth under an endless roof of stars, and you can let that humility relax you. You do not have to solve the origin story. You just have to feel how ancient it is, and how familiar. You find yourself standing at the base of a massive, stepped platform, its edges crisp in moonlight, its shadow falling across the street like a careful warning. The structure rises in tiers, each level pulling your gaze upward until the sky feels closer than it should. The bricks hold the heat of the day, releasing it slowly into the night. You place a hand on the surface and feel tiny grains of sand embedded in the mud brick, like the building is quietly reminding you it came from the earth and never fully forgot. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian cities built large temple platforms and, in later periods, especially ziggurats as monumental religious architecture. Archaeology suggests these were associated with temples and rituals, serving as elevated sacred spaces rather than as ordinary residences. The evidence we do have points to public religious function, civic identity, and the display of institutional power. You start climbing a staircase that feels endless. Each step is shallow but wide, built for processions, not for sprinting. Good thing, because you're not sprinting anywhere tonight. Halfway up, you pause and look back. The city spreads out below like a pattern of low roofs and courtyards. Canals glint faintly. Smoke drifts from a hearth. A dog trots through an alley like it owns the map. Up here, you understand the psychology of height. Height makes you feel closer to the divine, but it also makes you feel visible. A temple platform is a stage. Everyone can see the ritual. Everyone can see the offerings. Everyone can see the priests moving in careful formation. That visibility creates trust, or at least compliance. When people watch a ritual, they feel the world is being tended, like someone is sweeping the cosmic floor so it stays clean. One interpretation is that these platforms are not built only for the gods, but also for humans to experience a sense of alignment with the cosmos. The sky is the biggest thing anyone can see, and building upward is a way of responding to that bigness. It's possible that the architecture is a physical metaphor. Order rising from mud. Steps leading from everyday life to sacred space. You reach a terrace where a small shrine sits. The wind is stronger here, cooler, carrying the scent of river water and distant fires. A priest stands with an instrument, perhaps a small drum or rattle, setting a slow rhythm. You listen, and the rhythm steadies your thoughts. The night sky above is crowded with stars, and the building beneath your feet feels like a man-made mountain in a flat land. Now the mainstream anchor shifts toward meaning systems. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian peoples practiced various forms of divination, including reading celestial omens in later traditions. The evidence we do have includes texts that catalogue signs and interpret them. Even when the system feels strange to modern eyes, it served real social purposes: decision-making, reassurance, and the feeling that uncertainty could be managed. You watch as the priest marks something on a tablet. A bright planet hangs low, steady and luminous. A thin cloud passes. The priest murmurs a phrase. In your calm imagination, it is like watching someone take notes during a weather forecast, except the forecast is for politics, harvest, and whether the king should start a building project. Historians still argue whether ancient omen systems should be understood primarily as religious practice, proto-science, or political technology. There's no full consensus because the categories overlap. Observation is real. Interpretation is cultural. Political use is likely. The system can be all three at once. And that mix can feel mysterious, especially when you're standing on a high platform under a sky that looks endless. Now the mystery thread, clearly labelled. A fringe idea proposes that ziggurats and temple platforms were built as signal points, beacons, or even landing structures for visitors from the sky. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin for any literal landing function. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. But the idea has a certain cinematic pull. You can picture torches flaring, priests watching. A ritual meant to attract attention from above. A more cautious explanation could be that the sky connection is symbolic, rather than mechanical. The platform brings ritual closer to the heavens in a psychological sense. It creates a place where people can look outward and upward, where the community can feel anchored to the cosmos. And if we treat the landing idea as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it can still serve as a bedtime mood, a quiet rooftop vigil, the sense of waiting for a sign. The thrill of not knowing. You walk along the terrace and notice the corners of the structure align with cardinal directions, or at least feel intentionally oriented. Orientation matters. In many ancient cultures, alignment is part of making a sacred space. A careful reading might suggest that orientation is also a way of building the calendar into architecture. Sunrise and sunset positions change. Shadows move. The building becomes a giant measuring tool for time, even if that is not its only job. You step to the edge and watch the city below settle into night. Somewhere, a small lamp moves as a person walks through an alley. Somewhere, a drum keeps time. Somewhere, a couple argues quietly and then laughs, because human relationships are basically a loop of dramatic tension and snacks. You feel safe in the distance. The height gives you perspective, and perspective gives you calm. Now you encounter another strand of the night's theme, stairways and ladders in myth. Many traditions use imagery of ascent and descent, of divine movement between realms. One interpretation is that these images reflect temple platforms physically embedded in daily life. When you see a sacred building that rises above everything, you naturally speak about gods descending to it, or humans ascending in ritual. It's possible that architecture shapes metaphors. A popular rumor claims that ancient stories about skyladders and descending beings are eyewitness accounts. This theory isn't widely accepted, and it often relies on reading poetry as technical description. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can still ask a gentler question. What if the ladder is a metaphor for altered experience during ritual? For the feeling of contact that can arise through chant, incense, rhythm, and community focus. Humans can feel transported without physically traveling. That is true, even today. You watch a ritual begin. Priests move in a slow circle. An offering is lifted. A hymn is sung. The sound is not loud, it is steady. It matches the wind. And you realize why this is sleep-friendly. Repetition is a bridge into the quiet parts of the mind. The ritual is a kind of communal lullaby. It reassures everyone that the cosmos is being addressed. You walk to a small platform where a brazier burns. The flames flicker and bend in the wind. Smoke rises and disperses into the starry darkness. The fire feels like a message, not because it carries words, but because it carries intention. You can see how someone might imagine it reaching the divine. Fire is the human way of sending something upward. Now the cinematic what-if, carefully framed. What if a long time ago, a group of people stood right here and saw something unusual in the sky? A meteor, a comet, a strange conjunction of planets, an eclipse that turned day into dusk. They would not have had modern explanations, but they would have had language of signs. They might have told the story for generations. And when later scribes wrote myths, the memory of that unusual sky could have drifted into the imagery. That's a possibility, not a certainty. It is suggestive, not conclusive. But it is an emotionally plausible path for how sky events become sacred narrative. You take a slow breath and feel the wind cool your face. The structure beneath you is solid, heavy, human-made. The sky above is vast, indifferent, beautiful. Between the two is ritual, that delicate human bridge. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The evidence we do have points to temples as civic and religious centers. The rest is mood, the kind you can let float around you without needing it to be fact. You begin to descend the steps. Each step is a soft thud. Your thoughts slow with the rhythm. The city below feels warmer, more intimate, more human. You glance back once at the platform, towering and quiet. It stands like a thought made of bricks, an attempt to touch the sky without leaving the earth. And that attempt, whether you read it as religion, politics, architecture, or dream, is one of the most human things in history. You don't have to decide what it proves. You can simply feel the scale of it, the calm grandeur, and let your mind settle into the gentle question that keeps the night interesting. What if the story is pointing at something else? You drift into a marketplace just before dawn, when the sky is still dark, but the city is already awake in that quiet, purposeful way. Torches flicker, footsteps scuff packed earth. A donkey snorts like it has opinions about everything. And honestly, it probably does. The air smells like fish, onions, and fresh clay. A combination that should not work. But somehow it does, when everyone is half asleep and hungry. What's broadly accepted is that Sumerian city-states participated in extensive trade networks, exchanging local goods like textiles and agricultural products for resources scarce in southern Mesopotamia, such as timber, stone, and metals. Archaeology suggests long-distance exchange, evidenced by materials like lapis lazuli appearing far from their geological sources. The evidence we do have points to a world that is not isolated at all, but connected by river routes, overland caravans, and maritime travel along the Gulf. You watch traders set out goods on reed mats. One man unfolds a bolt of cloth dyed a deep colour that looks like the night got trapped in wool. Another displays copper tools that catch torchlight and make it dance. A woman shows small carved seals, each one a tiny artwork meant to leave a signature in clay. You realize trade is not only about objects. It is about trust, contracts, and storytelling. A merchant sells you a material thing, but they also sell you confidence that it is worth what they claim. You follow a group of boatmen toward the river. Their boats are low and sturdy, designed for cargo. One man checks rope knots with the seriousness of someone who understands that water does not negotiate with bad knots. They load baskets, jars, bundles wrapped in cloth. You notice how familiar this looks. People today still do the same thing, just with different packaging and more paperwork. One interpretation is that the experience of meeting foreigners and receiving exotic goods could have influenced mythic motifs about mysterious outsiders and gifts from beyond. It's possible that when a community sees a material it cannot produce, like a brilliant blue stone or a strong metal, the origin feels almost supernatural. The item arrives from a horizon no one in the village has personally crossed. That distance becomes mystery. You watch lapis lazuli in a trader's palm, deep blue with flecks like tiny stars. It feels like a piece of the sky fell into someone's hand. Your mind understands why later storytellers might connect such a stone to divinity, not because the stone is alien, but because it is rare. And humans always turn rare things into sacred things. Diamonds, gold, blue stones, even fancy coffee. If it's rare enough, someone will worship it eventually. Historians still argue whether specific references to faraway lands in Mesopotamian texts reflect direct knowledge from travelers, or whether they include mythologized geography that blends real places with symbolic ones. There's no full consensus because trade stories travel as rumors, and rumors gain perfume as they move. A place can be real and still become legendary in the telling. You wander deeper into the market and hear languages you do not recognize. The rhythms of speech shift, the vowels change, the gestures differ. You feel how trade creates cultural mixing. A cook learns a new spice. A metalworker learns a new technique. A scribe learns a new word. A family gains a new story about a relative who married someone from far away. This is how ideas move in a world without internet, slowly, by foot and boat, carried in mouths and minds. Now the mystery thread, carefully framed. A fringe idea proposes that legends of powerful teachers, or civilizers, who arrive bearing knowledge, are evidence of non-human intervention. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin for any literal outside-the-planet origin. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes a mood you can sit with. The image of a stranger stepping off a boat with unfamiliar tools, speaking with confidence, showing people a new way to measure, to build, to organize. A more cautious explanation could be that these teachers are simply skilled humans, merchants, craftsmen, diplomats, migrants, or scribes from other regions. In a world where techniques are not widely distributed, expertise itself can look like magic. A person who can smelt metal well, calculate weights, or navigate long distances reliably can feel almost superhuman to someone who has never seen those skills. You watch a trader demonstrate a scale, placing stones as weights, balancing a bag of grain. The act looks like justice in miniature. The bag rises, the stone drops, and the balance becomes a decision. This is a mainstream anchor too. Standardized measures and accounting systems were central to urban economies. The evidence we do have includes administrative texts and objects used for sealing and measurement. You notice seals again, those tiny carved cylinders. A merchant rolls one over wet clay, leaving an image that is both signature and story. Animals, gods, geometric patterns, scenes of offering or hunting. One interpretation is that seal imagery blends practical identification with mythic symbolism. It's possible that merchants used divine imagery as a way to invoke trust or protection, turning a business transaction into a sacred act. The line between commerce and religion is thin when the risk of loss is high. You follow a caravan leader as he checks pack animals. The animals shift, snort, flick their ears. The leader touches each load, testing weight distribution. He looks at the horizon with that practiced squint of someone who can read the land. You realize that long-distance travel is dangerous, not in a horror movie way, but in an exhausting way. Heat, thirst, bandits, sickness, getting lost. A successful trader is a person who survives uncertainty repeatedly. That alone earns them prestige. A popular rumor claims that ancient trade routes were guided by secret star maps given by divine beings. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it's a charming thought. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can still appreciate the reality behind it. People navigated by stars and landmarks. The sky is a map. Rivers are maps. Memory is a map. And when someone can guide you safely, it feels like they have a gift. You walk toward a dock area where goods are being unloaded from a boat that smells of brine and tar. The cargo includes shells, perhaps bitumen, maybe exotic woods, things that hint at travel beyond the river plains. The presence of maritime trade is widely discussed in Mesopotamian contexts, and the idea that communities connected by water could exchange goods and stories is grounded. The sea is a road, and roads carry myths as easily as they carry jars. Now the cinematic what-if, carefully framed. What if some of the most dramatic sky language in later retellings is actually the poetic exaggeration of travel? When you sail under a wide sky with no landmarks, the heavens feel close. When you cross deserts, the heat shimmers and the horizon becomes a mirage. A traveler returns and describes the world with a storyteller's flair. The story grows. The listener imagines impossible distances. The outsider becomes more than human in memory. You step into a small inn-like courtyard where travelers rest. Someone pours beer. Someone offers dried fish. Someone shows a child a foreign trinket. The child's eyes widen, like the object is from another planet, which, from the child's perspective, it basically is. You see the simplest origin of cosmic speculation, wonder at the unfamiliar. One interpretation is that myths about beings arriving with gifts can reflect this social dynamic. It's possible that arrival is a cultural category that includes any transformative contact, whether with foreign people, new materials, or new organizational techniques. That interpretation keeps you grounded while still honoring the feeling of mystery. Now you pause and listen to gossip, because gossip is one of history's most powerful engines. A trader whispers about a far city where buildings are made of stone. Someone else claims there's a mountain where the gods touch the earth. Another insists they saw a bright object streak across the sky on the road, a fire trail that made the animals panic. Meteors happen. People tell stories. Stories grow. The next time someone hears it, the meteor becomes a sign. The sign becomes a message. The message becomes a myth. Historians still argue whether the mythical geography of ancient texts should be read as a map of real trade networks, or as a symbolic landscape built for storytelling and ritual meaning. There's no full consensus, and that's okay. You are allowed to let both be true in different measures. You watch the sun's first hint touch the eastern edge of the sky. The market brightens. Colours become clearer. Faces look more tired and more real. Trade continues, not as a dramatic moment, but as a daily pulse. The shock is not that the ancient world needed outsiders to function. The shock is that it already functioned as a network, a web of exchange that connected distant regions long before modern empires. You take a slow breath and feel the city's morning energy settle into your bones. People haggle. People laugh. People complain. A child steals a date and runs. A parent pretends not to see for 2 seconds, because sometimes the world needs small mercies. The scene is intensely human, and that humanity is the anchor. And if your mind wants to float into the mist, you can let it, gently. What if every exotic stone and every foreign technique felt like a message from beyond the horizon, not beyond Earth, necessarily, but beyond your known world? The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You don't have to declare an answer. You can just feel how easy it is for a connected world to produce legends, and how calming it is to let those legends be stories while the facts remain facts. You walk into the city as the day cools toward evening again, when heat lifts off the bricks and the air turns soft and breathable. Smoke rises in thin columns from cooking fires. A faint scent of stew and baked bread drifts through alleys. Lamps begin to glow one by one, small amber dots that make the streets feel gentle rather than dark. Somewhere, a musician tests a reed flute, and the notes wobble slightly, like the instrument is stretching awake. What's broadly accepted is that Sumerian texts preserve a blend of practical records and mythic literature, and that the word Anunnaki belongs primarily to the mythic and religious side of that world. The evidence we do have points to a culture that recorded ration lists and legal agreements with the same material that carried hymns and epics. Clay does not care whether you write a receipt or a prayer. It simply holds the marks. That is the quiet magic of it. You wander into a small room where tablets are stored in baskets. A scribe is sorting them with the patience of someone who has accepted that the universe is mostly paperwork. The scribe's fingers trace labels. The room smells like dust and dry clay, and the silence feels thick. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the soft tap of stylus on tablet from a different day, a different century. You realize that the most surprising part of this whole topic is not an alien visitor. It's the fact that human voices can survive at all. One interpretation is that many modern reveals about ancient Sumer are really reveals about us. We look at old stories and want them to be about hidden forces, because hidden forces feel exciting. It's possible that the Anunnaki have become a modern symbol for mystery itself, a name people use when they want the past to feel larger than human. That doesn't make the curiosity bad. It makes it human. You step outside and walk along a quiet canal. The water reflects the lamps as long, trembling lines. A frog croaks once, then stops, as if it remembered it has an early meeting. The city feels calm, but it also feels layered. In every direction, there are things that are documented and things that are unknown. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Documented Sumerian city-states, temples, canals, writing, trade, and a complex pantheon are part of mainstream ancient Near Eastern history. Archaeology suggests long development, with earlier communities preceding the written record. The evidence we do have points to gradual change, human ingenuity, and institutions that shaped daily life. Interpreted. One interpretation is that myths reflect social realities, turning water management, labor systems, and political authority into cosmic drama. Another interpretation is that some mythic themes could preserve the emotional memory of events like floods, migrations, or dramatic sky phenomena, even if the details are not literal. Imagined, what if the stories are also a lantern held over the deepest unknown, the unrecorded centuries where humans lived, loved, fought, and dreamed without leaving us readable words? What if the past is not hiding a single secret, but 1,000 small ones we will never fully recover? Historians still argue whether the earliest mythic material should be read as faint memory of older events, or primarily as literary theology shaped by political needs. There's no full consensus, and that uncertainty is not a problem. It is the soft space where your mind can relax. You do not have to force a conclusion. Now the mystery thread, clearly labelled and kept gentle. A popular rumour claims that the Anunnaki were literal non-human beings who arrived on Earth and reshaped human history. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence from mainstream scholarship does not treat Sumerian myths as technical documentation of extraterrestrial contact. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. The evidence for literal arrival is thin. But the rumour persists because it gives a clean answer to a messy past. A more cautious explanation could be that Anunnaki and related divine groups represent the imagination of a culture grappling with power, nature, and meaning. The gods in these stories can be read as personified forces, political metaphors, ritual presences, or sincere objects of devotion. Depending on the text and context, it's possible that modern readers collapse these layers into one literal layer because literal feels simpler. You stop near a small household shrine where a lamp burns behind a clay screen. A woman replaces a dried offering with a fresh piece of bread. A child watches, then imitates, placing something small and earnest. That small action is a clue to what religion means here. It is not only grand temple architecture, it is everyday care. And that everyday care is documented in the sense that archaeology and texts both suggest a world where domestic and public ritual mattered. You walk toward a city gate as night deepens. Beyond it, the plain stretches out, dark and quiet. The river's presence felt more than seen. The stars are bright. You pause and look up, and you let the sky do what it always does. Invite stories. You can feel how easy it is to imagine watchers up there. You can also feel how easy it is to imagine that the watchers are just the stars themselves, indifferent and beautiful. Both feelings can exist at once, A fringe idea proposes that ancient myths are intentionally coded to hide true events from outsiders, leaving clues for future readers. This theory isn't widely accepted, and it often assumes a level of coordinated secrecy that is hard to support. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it can still be useful as a storytelling lens. It encourages careful reading, attention to symbolism, and respect for the idea that texts can carry layered meanings. The important part is not to mistake the lens for the landscape. You keep walking until you reach a quiet patch of ground outside the busiest streets. The noise drops. The air cools further. You hear only insects, a distant splash, and your own breathing. This is a good place to let the mind settle into a final thought that is both grounded and soothing. The grounded thought: human beings created cities, writing, and complex religious stories without needing a single dramatic external trigger. The evidence we do have points to long development, driven by environment, trade, conflict, cooperation, and creativity. Sumer's achievements are not less impressive if they are human. They are more impressive. Mud becomes architecture. Counting becomes mathematics. Ritual becomes community glue. Clay becomes memory. The soothing thought: mystery is allowed, not as a replacement for facts, but as a companion to them. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. The unrecorded centuries, the lost oral stories, the lives that left no names, the small decisions that changed everything. Those are the true hidden rooms. Now the wind down begins, slow and gentle, like a blanket settling. You imagine the city at night from above, not as a place of secrets and conspiracies, but as a soft constellation of lamplight. Each lamp marks a household. Each household holds someone who is tired, someone who hopes for a good harvest, someone who worries about a sick child, someone who is laughing quietly so they don't wake the neighbors. The temples stand taller, but the real heartbeats are in the small rooms, where bread is shared and stories are told low and close. You think of the clay tablets resting in baskets, cooling in storerooms, waiting. They are patient. They do not demand that you solve them. They do not demand that you choose one interpretation forever. They simply sit there, holding their wedge marks like tiny footprints. And the longer you look, the more you realize those footprints belong to ordinary hands. The stars keep shining. The canal water keeps moving. The night air keeps softening. Your breathing slows, and you let your shoulders drop. If your mind drifts toward a dramatic image of beings arriving from the sky, you let it drift, but you keep it labeled as imagination, a calm what if, not a conclusion. And if your mind drifts toward the quiet truth of humans shaping their world with mud and numbers, you let that drift too, because it is steady and warm. You don't need a shocking answer tonight. You only need the feeling of distance, the long, gentle span of time, the comfort of knowing that people have always searched for meaning under the same sky. The world is old, and you are safe in your small corner of it, listening to a story that fades like lamplight at the edge of a canal. Your eyes grow heavy. The city's sounds become a hush. The last thing you see in your mind is a single lamp behind a clay screen, glowing steadily, as if it's been waiting for you to rest. End of script. Sweet dreams.